So, as you know, the Dinsdale Award was established by the Society for Scientific Exploration and Henry Bauer. This was in 1992, and the reason was to recognize significant contributions to the expansion of human understanding through the study of unexplained phenomena. This year, the awards committee consisted of Henry Bauer, David Moncrief, and myself as chair, and I'm delighted to present this year's award to a very deserving winner, and that is Patrick Huyghe. So Patrick Huyghe has done a huge amount in his career, which is ongoing, as a writer, editor, and publisher. He was editor of Science Digest for 3 years in the 1980s. He was a science reporter on NPR, All Things Considered, and Morning Edition. And he was involved in a number of other science writing and editing positions. Yesterday morning, after my talk, Patrick came up to me and he said, "Garrett, in your talk you talked about how we really shouldn't trust the news media for our science news, and we need to look at the original sources." And he said, "And yet you're giving me the Dinsdale Award?" So there's more to the story of what Patrick has done. He's made a career of bringing information about the analysis of anomalies to a wide general audience through books and articles and a wide range of media. He publishes The Anomalist, a journal that explores mysteries of science, nature, and history. He's also well known to SSE members as the creator and editor of our EdgeScience magazine, which has now been passed on to Annalisa as editor. Patrick co-founded Paraview Press, which publishes anomalistic material shunned by the major normal sorts of outlets and news sources. The quality as well as the range of his published books is really impressive. His books include, and there's a whole list, I won't go through all of them, Glowing Birds, Stories from the Edge of Science in 1985. Columbus Was Last from 200,000 BCE to 1492, A Heretical History of Who Was First in 2005. Swamp Gas Times, My 2 Decades on the UFO Beat, 2011. Intermediate States, The Anomalist Book, 2011. And he co-authored books on small comets, lake monsters, UFOs, Bigfoot, and more. I'm really delighted to be able to present this award to Patrick.
Thank you, Garrett. Thank you. Appreciate it.
The award reads, Tim Dinsdale Memorial Award, Patrick Huyghe, for bringing awareness of unexplained phenomena in science to a broad audience through evidence-based reporting in journals as an author of many books and with the publication of a wide range of books and journals.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Garrett, and thank you to the Dinsdale Committee. Do you hear me? Okay. You might be asking yourself, well, what's he doing up here? I've had to ask myself the same question for this presentation. I'm not a scientist, even though a kid in my neighborhood calls me Albert Einstein when I have crazy hair. But I've spent a good part of my writing career following and writing about Maverick claims. Most of them put forward by respected scientists. Some of what I say might resonate with your own experiences, but each Maverick experience is different to some degree. So I'll begin at the beginning when I was about this tall. My parents used to have people over for dinner sometimes, and whenever they did, I would take a pencil, make it really sharp, and then I'd go around the table and poke everybody in the arm. And my parents would say, "Great, he's going to be a doctor." So I had the right tool, but the wrong task. So what I really wanted to do was be a writer. So I ended up going to graduate school at Syracuse University, where I had a master's in magazine journalism. After I graduated, I moved to New York City, where that was the hub of magazine publishing. And magazine publishing at that time was, you might call it, the print internet of the time. There were magazines on every possible subject, from Candy Marketing Weekly to Oceans Magazine. It was like unbelievable. And just when I moved to New York City, a bunch of science magazines popped up. Science Digest, Omni Magazine, the AAA EdgeScience magazine. And so I was interested in science, so I decided, well, I'm going to freelance some science. But since I was a beginner, I couldn't go after the big stories like Hubble or DNA stories. Those stories went to staff writers and established journalists. So I had to find my own little niche. So I went after some smaller, more controversial stories. One story I went after was a man named Grover Krantz. He was an experimental physical anthropologist at Washington State University. And his interest was piqued when he came across tracks of a recent Bigfoot case, where the cast of the right foot was distorted. There were two bulges on the outside edge of the foot that had probably been caused by some inflammation of the cartilage between the bones. So Krantz reconstructed the bones of that foot, and then he compared the gigantic left foot of the creature to a 17-inch blow-up of a human foot. And what he realized is the proportions were shifted. The heel was relatively enormous, and the position of the ankle was set substantially further forward. He then constructed a biomechanical model of what became known as the cripple foot cast. And Krantz concluded that the footprints had been left by an animal about 8 feet tall and weighing about 800 pounds, which is roughly what people have been reported. So that was one of my stories. Another one was a story of a young researcher at the Women's Community College in San Jose, California. She was studying a large database of variability in surgical bleeding. She decided to compare those times to a variety of geophysical variables. And she found that periods of bleeding anomalies occurred following periods of increased solar activity and before large magnitude earthquakes. And that research was done by a woman familiar to the SSE, that's Marcia Adams. And she decided to examine whether human sensitives could be used as tools for predicting earthquakes. And she set up a study to do just that. So the first lesson here is, don't dismiss a rookie reporter's interest in your Maverick claim. Don't wait for a big shot journalist to come around and talk to you about it. Now, I've been asked what I had to do to get my Maverick stories published. Was there resistance? Actually, not really, as long as the story was worthwhile. But I would never touch a Maverick claim that lacked real evidence. I couldn't go to my publisher with the Rudy Giuliani line, "We have a theory, we just don't have the facts yet." But I did have to do one thing for my stories. I had to include a skeptical remark. Now, finding a skeptic was really easy. Finding an educated skeptic was really hard, because I wanted someone to be familiar enough with the material to give a reasonable, even though negative, comment. Then in 1982, a long time ago, I saw a notice about a new scientific society in Science magazine. It was something disarmingly called the Society for Scientific Exploration. The first meeting would take place in College Park, Maryland. And I said, I've got to go there. I showed up at the very first meeting of the SSE. Now, for me, the SSE is like a kid in a candy store. I mean, you're full of stories. I mean, this was wonderful as a journalist. Now, I'm going to present a case study, which was the rest of my talk, basically. And it allowed me to see behind the scenes of a struggle for recognition of a Maverick claim. Now, I've presented on this case before at the SSE, but not this aspect of the case. But some background to begin with. The scientist in this case was Louis Frank. He was a plasma physicist at the University of Iowa. As a student there, he aided James Van Allen in the calibration of the first lunar probes, Pioneers 3 and 4. By the 1980s, he had had more instruments aboard spacecraft, either as principal investigator or co-investigator, than any other scientist in the world. He discovered the Theta aurora above the polar cap. He measured the plasma ring around Jupiter and Saturn. He discovered the rings current around the Earth. I mean, he was a mainstream scientist through and through, very well respected. Then in the 1980s, early 1980s, he had an imager aboard a spacecraft called Dynamics Explorer. And basically, the imager was designed to study the Earth's aurora. That was his interest. So the images came back from the Dynamics Explorer, and the images showed some dark spots on the image. Most scientists would have said, well, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm interested in the aurora. Forget the rest of it. But Frank wanted to know every single detail of the image. And he wanted to know what these dark spots were. So he went to a graduate student and said, you figure it out. He spent a couple of years trying to figure out what these dark spots were. So were they glitches in the software? Were they dead pixels? Were there paint flecks on the imager? Every possible thing. Finally, he realized that it was none of these things. It was an actual geophysical phenomena that was going on. But what was going on? Basically, he ended up concluding that the black spots were massive clouds of water vapor, very high in the atmosphere. But they were so high up, they had to come from out there, not from down here. He ended up calling them atmospheric holes, these dark spots in the images. And he concluded that we were being bombarded by giant snowballs, which he calls small comets. Basically, at an altitude of about 800 miles, the comets would be disrupted by tidal or electrostatic disruption. At 300 miles, they would be vaporized. And at 60 miles, they would be just totally dispersed with all the other atmospheric goings-on. Now, this did not go too well in the mainstream, especially among astronomers who said, if the small comets were out there, we would know about it. Now, if Frank had claimed there were 10 small comets coming in each year, or 100 small comets coming in each year, I don't think anyone would have blinked. The problem was, he claimed they were coming in every minute. Now, I'm not going to show you the evidence of this. I'm not here to convince you of the reality of the claim. I've presented this elsewhere. I've given an SSE video YouTube presentation on the subject and in a book. But that's not the purpose of this talk. The purpose is to give you an insight as to what happens when a maverick scientist who has all his ducks in a row and attempts to convince other scientists and the outside world of their claim. Now, how did I become involved in this story? Well, I saw a story in the New York Times that said, "New theory for the origin of the oceans." And it was basically Frank saying that the small comets were probably responsible for bringing the waters to the Earth. So I decided to propose this story to Oceans Magazine, where I knew the editor, and he gave me the go-ahead. I attended the next meeting of the American Geophysical Union, where Frank was giving a talk. I interviewed Frank, his critics, and I wrote my article. It turns out that the idea of small comets being the origin of the ocean wasn't Frank's idea. Frank had sent his paper, his original discovery paper, which hadn't been published yet, to Thomas Donahue, who was a highly respected atmospheric physicist. He wanted some feedback, and Donahue pointed out, if you are correct about the current influx of small comets, that influx over the age of the Earth would give you the right amount of water to fill the oceans. And Frank went, well, damn. He's right. So, little thing there. So when it came time for Frank to announce his discovery to the scientific community, he chose Geophysical Research Letters. That's the place where most discoveries in geophysics are announced. Alex Dessler was the editor at the time, but Frank's paper was too long. GRL had a set length for papers of 4 pages. So he said, Frank, give me 2 papers. Give me your data paper and give me your interpretation paper. So he split it up, and that turns out to have been brilliant and very useful for Frank's argument, because no one could argue with the data. The data was the data. That's all there was to it. And whenever someone doubted his interpretation, he would say, okay, what's your interpretation of the data? And to date, no one has been able to look at that data and give a reasonable interpretation. So the GRL editor sent the papers out to 2 reviewers. And both of them told him, don't publish the interpretation paper. Now, reviews are designed to guide, not bind the editor. And Dessler went ahead and published the papers anyway. He got a lot of flack for it, and he had to explain himself later on. And this is what he said, basically paraphrased. I would rather publish a paper that is wrong on occasion than to miss publishing a paper that is of major importance. And if Frank is correct, this is of major importance. So that's another lesson for the Maverick scientist. You need to be lucky. And in this case, you have to find an open-minded editor who will publish your work in a science journal. Now, back to my Oceans magazine article. The tone of my articles was pretty skeptical. I'm going to read you the first paragraph. Naturally, he's being accused of making a mountain out of a molehill. What else can you say about a man who tries to explain the source of the oceans from a rain of icy comets? It's all quite hard to believe, especially since his entire theory is based on a bunch of dark spots that appeared on some satellite images of the Earth. The rest is interpretation, beginning with his insistence that those dark spots can only be a sign of water vapor. And the only way to get water vapor that high up, he reasons, is if small comets are disintegrating as they hurtle into our atmosphere. Frank read my article, called me, and invited me to write a book about his discovery. So that's where I entered the rabbit hole of a Maverick scientist. I said yes. Turns out Frank had received a lot of flack, too. He had to respond to a dozen critical papers in GRL, and he spent 1.5 years doing that. And they were from fields from planetary atmospheres to astronomy to geophysics. And all this material would make its way into the book, as well as the result of a telescopic search by a Jet Propulsion Laboratory skeptic who turned out to provide further evidence for the existence of small comets. And so did a radiometer radiometer readings of the upper atmosphere by a meteorologist at the University of Pennsylvania, which shows blobs of water vapor impossibly high in the atmosphere. But again, this is not about the evidence for the claim. So a couple of years later, the book comes out. It's called The Big Splash. Frank didn't like the title, but that was the publisher's title. It was bylined by Louis Frank with Patrick Huyghe. In the meantime, Frank was still doing his science work, and he was working on imagers for another spacecraft called Polar. He had 3 imagers aboard that spacecraft. And he made some adjustments to them to see if he could learn a little bit more about the small comets in doing so. So Polar went up, the images came back, and they completely corroborated what Dynamics Explorer had found. And this was big because it was a different satellite, different imagers, same results. Polar was a NASA satellite, and it was appropriate that Frank's announcements would be made through NASA. So Frank approached me again and said, I want you to coordinate the press event. So off I went to NASA Goddard to work with their audiovisual department to produce the press materials. And deeper into the rabbit hole I went. The press conference at NASA Goddard for Frank's discovery was absolutely mobbed. And the press afterwards called it a vindication of Frank's theory. And this was largely thanks to Tom Donahue, the critic, who had told reporters, this is a vindication. Now, shortly after the announcement, NASA told the science manager at Polar to quickly resolve the small comets issue. He said he works on it, and he discovered that nothing could be done quickly, and more importantly, nothing could be done cheaply. So the idea was dropped. And after the initial widespread acceptance of the results by the press, the skeptics started pouring on again, and Frank had to reply once again. At that point, Frank invited me back to Iowa, where I interviewed him again at length, and we put together an additional 12 chapters to bring the story up to date. Frank wanted an updated edition of The Big Splash with these new chapters, but the publisher was not interested, and our literary agent was not able to convince any other publisher to publish it as well. The good news is that the Polar results encouraged other scientists to go out and try to look for the small comets. One group used the NEAT telescope in Hawaii, and after their search, they went back to the American Geophysical Union and reported that they had found no small comets in their search. But this was not a surprise to Frank, because he pointed out that the small comets are fainter than anything that telescope can detect, especially since that telescope could not lock in at the right speed. The only way for a telescope to track the small comets is in a kind of skeet shooting mode, which was used previously by the GPL scientists with the Spacewatch telescope. Another team decided to use the Spacewatch telescope again, and once again they showed their images at an AGU presentation and said there were no small comets. There were no streaks parallel to the star trails. So Frank stood up during the presentation and said, wait, right there, I see a little small comet trail. The signature of a small comet is a trail that appears at angles to the stars. So they weren't even looking for the right thing. So the team pulled the view graphs from the screen and never let Frank analyze their data. Now the problem with Frank's evidence, it was because it was Frank's data. Could anybody else find the same thing? This brings up an incident which turned out to be Frank's last battle, big battle, and it was a legal one. What happened is that Frank convinced one of his colleagues in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Iowa, a radio astronomer, to search for the small comets. So he and the graduate student, John Sigwarth, set up the search, and the search was conducted by the colleague. And he promised to share the data with Frank. The problem is the colleague didn't share the data with Frank ahead of the colleague's presentation at the AGU. Frank was caught off guard, though not surprised when the colleague announced they had found no small comets in their search. Not only that, but the university press office put out a press release about the colleague's findings without ever seeking a comment from Frank. And Frank definitely had a comment. Basically, he said they had failed to understand what a small comet trail would look like, and they thought it could be identified simply through visual inspection. In fact, the trails had to be evaluated for validity with careful statistical evaluation. Now, the problem arose when the local newspaper ran a story on this, and the headline said, "Frank alleges fraud." Frank, said the reporter, had said that the colleague had doctored the images. Frank had never said any such thing, and people who were with him when he was interviewed supported Frank's denial. But the colleague then filed charges through the university, accusing Frank of an ethics violation. So he had to hire a lawyer for the hearing. The hearing eventually concluded, the panel eventually concluded, that the incident had probably been due to a misunderstanding by the reporter, though they concluded that Frank had committed two violations. One, by claiming that his colleague's conduct was clouded by anger over a tenure decision, and two, that Frank had made no effort to deny those statements publicly, though Frank had indeed sent a letter to the local newspaper doing just that. Frank and Sigwarth eventually published a paper based on the colleague's data, which he finally received. And for the most part, the small comets were too faint to be discovered by the naked eye in the images. It took the grad student, Sigwarth, 3 months of computation on their fastest computers to eliminate the possibility that the small comet trails could be identified, were actually noise. And their paper appeared in the Journal of Geophysical Research. This proved to be Frank's last hurrah. 2 years later, in April of 2003, Frank suffered a stroke that effectively ended his career. In December of 2010, John Sigwarth, who was Frank's partner in small comet crime, was then a senior scientist at the heliocentric division of NASA Goddard, and he died of an aortic aneurysm at the age of 49. 4 years later, in 2014, Frank himself passed away. Now, before composing an obituary for Louis Frank in 2014, I called up Bob Hoffman, who was the NASA science manager for the Polar spacecraft. And I asked him if anyone had come up with an alternative explanation for the data that Frank had accumulated on the small comets. He said no. So I said, his small comet explanation still stands as far as you're concerned? He says, yes, it does. But that didn't matter. The mainstream simply assumed that the small comets had been explained away. Frank didn't exist, and neither did the small comets. The next lesson for the Maverick scientist: don't die. So that's where things stood until I received an email out of the blue in March of 2021. It came from someone who urged me to get the Big Splash republished so that the mainstream could no longer sweep the small comets under the rug. That person is in the audience today. His name is Bill Abbott. He was right, of course. I was the only one left who could do that. What a strange position to be in. I mean, I had those half-dozen chapters, which had never been published, in a big box in my garage, along with pounds of supporting papers and materials. And I've been feeling guilty about it. What was I going to do? I mean, I had this. What was I going to do with it? So Bill said, you got to do something with it. So I contacted Frank's daughters, and I got their permission to contact the original publisher to reacquire the rights of the book. And this turned out to be a perfect COVID project. So I spent several months preparing those chapters, eliminating some of Frank's more acerbic comments to avoid legal problems, putting together the references for those chapters, selecting the photographs, and the product, which I ended up publishing through my book publishing company, is called The Big Splash. It's called Cosmic Rain, which is the title that Frank originally wanted for the book. Now, the first part of the book is The Big Splash. The second part of the book are all the subsequent chapters. Now, since then, my efforts to get the scientific establishment to pay attention to the book have been met with a deafening silence. We, Bill and I, have sent the book out to many people, selected people, scientists who originally expressed interest in the small comets, or who should have an interest in the small comets, as well as reporters who had written about the Dynamics Explorer and polar results. These are people who we thought should be willing to give this material the time of day. But all I've gotten is silence. When I tried to get the book reviewed by a publication known for reviewing unorthodox material, the book reviewer informed me that the small comets had been shown not to exist. Really. So, to conclude, if, as a Maverick scientist, you have the data, the evidence, and plenty of it to support your claim, an open-minded editor who accepts your work for a scientific journal, the backing of a respected organization like NASA to present your results, and a journalist, actually many journalists, I was not the only one, who gave your claim a fair shake. You would think that would be sufficient for acceptance, or at least serious attention by the mainstream. But as you can tell, it's not. So maybe the determinative issue is how far out of the mainstream is your claim? And Frank's claim was, quite frankly, out of this world. The thought of small comets disintegrating every minute right now triggers everyone's boggle threshold. And Frank realized that. But consider this. You go to the NASA website, and you'll see this statement. Scientists estimate that about 50 tons of meteoritic, i.e. rocky, materials falls on the Earth each day, almost all of which is vaporized in the Earth's atmosphere. 50 tons of rocks each day. That should trigger your boggle threshold as well. But that's accepted by mainstream scientists. So I hope this example of the way a solid but maverick claim can be expected to be treated by the mainstream doesn't discourage you. Me, I'm stuck at the bottom of the rabbit hole. Here's some information about the book, my website presentation on the evidence to the SSE, the Small Comets website, which I created for Frank back in the 90s. It looks very primitive, but it has all of his published papers, and a contact information at cosmicrainbook@icloud.com. Thank you.